On the morning of September 3rd, 1939, the radio aboard U-30 had been humming with traffic all morning. The commander, Fritz Julius Lemp, knew his boat was somewhere off the northwest coast of Scotland, well within its designated patrol area. The signal, when it came, was bald and deeply shocking. Britain and France had declared war on Germany. At around 4:30 that afternoon, the watch picked up the outline of a large ship on the horizon. Lemp decided on pursuit. Through the periscope, he noted she was blacked out and zigzagging on a defensive course. Lemp concluded she must be a British armed merchant cruiser, fair game under the prize rules. No warning was necessary. He gave the order to fire 2 torpedoes. One found its target, ripping open the bulkhead between the engine and boiler rooms. As U-30 closed on the stricken ship, radio operator Georg Hogel tuned into the shipping wavelength and heard the distress call. He knew her name from the call sign, the Athenia. She was an ocean liner bound for Canada with more than 1,400 passengers and crew on board, including over 300 Americans. Lemp was shocked. He had made a ghastly mistake. So began the Battle of the Atlantic, a struggle that would last nearly 6 years and decide the fate of Britain. The question was whether the Royal Navy could protect the convoys that kept the nation alive, and whether Germany's U-boats could cut that lifeline before America entered the war. In those first hours, no one could have predicted how the battle would unfold. Lemp had disobeyed all orders by failing to help the survivors, and within 24 hours, news of this German outrage had been reported around the world. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels denied responsibility, claiming the British had torpedoed their own ship. Hitler tightened restrictions on U-boat operations, forbidding attacks on passenger ships. Lemp made his crew promise secrecy, and when U-30 returned to Wilhelmshaven, the war diary was rewritten to remove any reference to the Athenia. Karl Dönitz, the leader of the U-boat arm, played his part in the elaborate deception. It had not been an auspicious start. Germany's first blow in the war at sea had only succeeded in embarrassing the Führer. Just 8 days later, another incident revealed how unprepared the Royal Navy was for its task. The destroyer HMS Walker was escorting a small convoy out of Liverpool, with the destroyer HMS Vanquisher in support. Both ships had been called out of retirement only weeks before, their crews hastily assembled from reservists, bank clerks and fishermen. Sub-Lieutenant John Adams, a regular officer, kept a diary of those early days. Maintaining station in a darkened convoy was proving difficult for men who had never worked together, and the weather was poor. On the night of September 11th, the convoy was struggling to maintain formation in the darkness. Adams went to bed at 9 o'clock to get some sleep before his watch. He was flung out of his bunk at 10 that evening by a terrific lurch and thud. He thought at first that the ship had been hit by a torpedo. When he reached the deck, he saw that Walker had collided with Vanquisher. The ships were jammed together in the darkness, twisted metal grinding against twisted metal. The captain of HMS Walker had called Vanquisher over from the far side of the convoy and ordered her to form astern. On Walker's bridge, the officer on watch misjudged Vanquisher's course, mistaking her bow wave for her stern wave. Vanquisher was crossing directly ahead of Walker. 14 men were killed in the collision. The first lieutenant was forced to shoot one badly injured man who was caught in the wreckage. A signalman was found holding onto a friend whose legs had been torn off as the ships came apart. Both ships survived, but the incident was a grisly introduction to the realities of war. The Royal Navy had spent 20 years preparing for a surface fleet battle, not close escort work. None of the officers had practiced convoy protection before the war. No one had trained with the new underwater detection device ASDIC in real conditions. It was a sharp lesson in the gap between confidence and experience, a gap the U-boats were eager to exploit. In the first weeks of the war, Karl Dönitz had begun planning a mission he hoped would shake the confidence of the enemy and impress the leaders of the Reich. He chose Germany's newest hero for the task, the commander of U-47, a 31-year-old merchant Navy veteran named Günther Prien. Short and plump with a boyish face, Prien had already sunk 3 British freighters on his first war patrol. Dönitz offered him the most daring operation yet conceived, a night penetration of Scapa Flow, the main anchorage of the British Home Fleet. On the afternoon of Friday, October 13th, U-47 lay on the bottom of the North Sea, waiting for darkness and slack tide. Prien had spent the day studying aerial photographs of the flow's defences. He would have to navigate through a narrow channel between sunken block ships in Kirk Sound, a channel barely 50 feet wide and 23 feet deep. As darkness fell, he gave the order to surface. The northern lights lit the horizon with a shimmering glow, but Prien pressed on regardless. The flood tide swept U-47 westward at an unbelievable speed. In Kirk Sound, the boat was caught by one of the cables holding the block ships in place. The stern touched the cable, but with careful maneuvering, the boat was free. At midnight, Prien whispered to his crew, "We are in." The great anchorage lay before him. He identified two fat fellows anchored close to the shore, one of them the battleship HMS Royal Oak. At a range of 3,000 meters, he fired a salvo of torpedoes, all missed. Prien swung U-47 around and fired his stern torpedo, a second miss. He reloaded and fired again from closer range. This time 3 torpedoes struck the Royal Oak in quick succession. A magazine exploded and the ship began to list. In 13 minutes she rolled over and sank, taking 833 men with her. One of the few to escape from below decks, a leading seaman, was pulled from the water badly burned. U-47 slipped back through Kirk Sound and out into the open sea. As the boat steamed for home, someone painted a crude white charging bull on the conning tower, a symbol of the blow Dönitz had struck against the Royal Navy's pride. The autumn of 1939 gave way to a bitter winter in the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy's confidence in its ASDIC detection system remained high, even as the U-boats began to probe its limits. On the night of January 11, 1940, a young commander set out to demonstrate just how fragile that confidence was. His boat, U-23, was a small Type II duck of only 250 tons, with just 4 torpedoes aboard. But he had something more valuable than tonnage: nerve. Kretschmer edged U-23 past 2 anti-submarine trawlers guarding the entrance to Inverness Bay, close to the Orkney port of Kirkwall. The night was moonless, and the U-boat slipped through the picket line on the surface, completely undetected. Inside the bay, a large tanker lay at anchor, the Danish-registered Denmark. Kretschmer lined up his shot and fired a single torpedo at close range. The Denmark sank within minutes. The trawlers swept the anchorage with searchlights and ASDIC pulses, but they found nothing. U-23 had already escaped into the open sea, leaving the British to assume the loss was a mine or an internal explosion. The ASDIC had never heard a thing. The lesson was plain: a U-boat on the surface at night was all but invisible to the Royal Navy's underwater eye. Yet the Admiralty was slow to adjust. The spring of 1940 brought new threats from the air as well. On May 15th, the anti-submarine whaler HMS Windermere was on patrol off the northeast coast of Scotland when 4 Heinkel bombers appeared out of the clouds. The ship carried only a single Lewis gun for defense. The 19-year-old commanding officer watched the bombs fall and knew one had his name on it. The near-miss wrecked Windermere's bridge and tore through Jameson's hand and arm. He gave the order to take cover as the Heinkels strafed the crippled ship, but somehow no one was killed. The bombers broke off only when their ammunition ran dry. Jameson spent the next 5 months in hospital, and the Windermere limped back to Aberdeen as a testament to a simple fact: the Royal Navy was fighting the U-boat war with ships and weapons designed for a different conflict entirely. In June 1940, the armies of the Reich completed their conquest of France. The British Expeditionary Force had been scooped from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving behind its tanks, trucks, and artillery. For the men of the U-boat arm, this victory brought an opportunity they had scarcely dared to hope for. Karl Dönitz wasted no time. Within days of the French surrender, he climbed into a 6-cylinder BMW and set out for the Atlantic coast. His objective was Lorient, a sleepy fishing port on the Bay of Biscay that would soon become the epicenter of Germany's war on Allied shipping. The journey south was strange and chaotic. The roads were clogged with refugees, and Dönitz's car picked up 2 German Jews trying to reach England. The admiral joked with them, told them to give the British his regards, and dropped them in Le Mans. It was a peculiar episode, one that Dönitz's adjutant would remember for the rest of his life. But the admiral's mind was on other matters. He inspected the harbour at Lorient and found it ideal. The French dockyard superintendent seemed willing to cooperate. By July, the first U-boat swept up the River Scorff on the Atlantic tide. That boat was U-30, the same vessel whose commander had sunk the liner Athenia on the first day of the war. Her radio operator, Georg Hogel, remembered the strangeness of arriving in an undamaged French port. The town was peaceful, untouched by war. A plume of smoke rose from a burning oil dump, but that was all. Hogel was given a room at the Hotel Beau Séjour. There was post from home waiting for him. It was a small miracle, and it made the war feel suddenly distant. But the purpose of this new base was deadly serious. From Lorient, a U-boat could reach the Atlantic convoy routes in 2 days instead of 7. That meant more time hunting, less time traveling. Dönitz chose the Chateau Carnival, a gaudy seaside villa on a peninsula overlooking the harbour, as his new headquarters. The walls of his operations room were soon covered with maps and coloured flags marking the positions of his boats. The U-boat arm had found its home, and the hunting was about to begin in earnest. Otto Kretschmer sailed from Lorient in late July 1940, commanding a new boat, the Type 7B U-99. He was 28 years old, quiet, unemotional, and utterly professional. His crew called him Silent Otto, but they trusted him completely. In the radio room, a young midshipman named Volkmar Koenig kept watch. In the bow compartment, 20 men shared their bunks with torpedoes. The boat smelled of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and damp food. It was home for 43 men, and it would be home for weeks. Kretschmer set a course northwards across the Bay of Biscay towards the western approaches. The weather was fine and the sea was calm. On the conning tower, lookouts in their heavy leather suits scanned the horizon for smoke. On the 4th day, they found it. A convoy was steaming westwards, slow and fat. Kretschmer noted its weak escort, just 2 destroyers. He decided to wait for nightfall. When darkness came, Kretschmer attacked on the surface. The U-boat was almost invisible against the black water, its silhouette too small to be seen from a destroyer's bridge. Kretschmer fired 3 torpedoes in quick succession. One struck a tanker called the Jersey City. The ship went up in a column of flame and water. The escort, HMS Walker, rushed to the spot and began dropping depth charges. But they were firing blind. Kretschmer had already moved on. Over the next several hours, Kretschmer sank 3 more ships, all tankers. He attacked from inside the convoy, between the columns of merchantmen, where the escorts could not follow. His torpedoes hit one after another, each strike sending a geyser of fire into the Atlantic night. The escorts could not stop him. They did not have the numbers, the training, or the equipment to fight a surface battle in the dark. By dawn, Kretschmer had claimed 4 ships for nearly 30,000 tons. U-99 was heading home, and the crew was jubilant. A few weeks later, another young commander put to sea. He was 26 years old, tall and blond, with the sharp blue eyes of a true believer. He commanded the Type 2 Duck U-57, a boat so small that the crew called it a dugout. Painted on the conning tower were 2 red devils carrying torches, one for life and one for death. He had chosen that emblem deliberately. He believed in walking a fine line between survival and destruction. On the 2nd day of his patrol, a British bomber caught U-57 on the surface. The bombs fell close, and one of Top's 2 diesel engines was torn from its foundations. The chief engineer recommended turning back. The watch officer disagreed. Top listened to both, then made his decision. He ordered the boat to continue towards the British coast on one engine. If the remaining engine failed, they would never make it home. But Top was young, ambitious, and he had not fired a single torpedo. On the night of August 23rd, Top found a convoy in the North Channel. He attacked from the surface with 3 torpedoes, and all 3 hit their marks. 2 freighters went down, but the escorts had seen the torpedo tracks, and they were coming. Top ordered an emergency dive, but the water was shallow, only 50 meters deep. He had nowhere to hide. The depth charges began to fall, each explosion hammering the boat's hull like a giant fist. For 22 hours, Top and his crew lay on the bottom while the destroyers hunted them overhead. The lights went out. Valves began to leak, and water seeped in. The air grew thick with carbon dioxide. The men lay in their bunks, barely moving, conserving oxygen. Top waited until midnight, then gave the order to surface. The compressed air tanks were almost empty, but the boat rose. It broke the surface within 1,000 meters of a destroyer, but the destroyer did not see them. Top escaped on one engine, limping home with a damaged boat and a record of 4 ships sunk. Dönitz was waiting on the dock to shake his hand. By October, Dönitz had enough boats to try something new. He had been planning it for years. The Wolf Pack. His idea was simple. Instead of sending single U-boats to hunt for convoys, he would string a line of boats across the convoy routes. The first boat to sight a convoy would radio the position. The others would close in, and at night they would attack together, overwhelming the escorts with sheer numbers. On October 16th, the system was put to its first major test. Slow convoy SC-7 left the Canadian port of Sydney, Nova Scotia, with 35 ships. They were old, slow, and laden with timber, steel, and grain. The escort was pitiful, 1 sloop, 2 corvettes, and a handful of armed trawlers. On the night of October 18th, the wolf pack struck. Kretschmer was there. So was the ace Joachim Schepke, handsome and fearless, and the bull of Scapa himself, Gunther Prien. The escorts could not cover the 5-mile front. The U-boats slipped through like wolves into a sheep pen. That night, Kretschmer sank 5 ships from inside the convoy, firing torpedoes in both directions as the merchantmen scattered. Schepke and Prien claimed 3 more. By dawn, 18 ships had been lost, almost 80,000 tons of shipping. The survivors floating in the oil-covered water could hear the German crews shouting to each other in the darkness, celebrating their kills. 2 nights later, the same pack found convoy HX-79 and sank 12 more ships. In October alone, U-boats sank 63 ships, totaling more than 440,000 tons. The Admiralty was stunned. In London, Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May, studied the charts with growing dread. The U-boat was bleeding Britain white. But the wolf pack had also revealed a weakness. The attacks relied on constant radio traffic, and that traffic could be intercepted. If the British could read those signals, they might be able to route the convoys around the waiting packs. The question was how to break the code that protected those radio messages. The answer was already on its way across the Atlantic, carried aboard a U-boat that would not slip away. The winter of 1940 was the darkest hour for Britain, and the Prime Minister knew it. The charts on his desk at number 10 told a story of slow strangulation, a line plunging toward catastrophe. Imports had fallen from 60 million tons before the war to barely 30 million. Every curve on those graphs pointed in one direction, toward a point where the country would simply run out of food and raw materials to fight. Donald McDougall, the young economist who prepared the weekly figures, watched the stocks of imported goods sink toward a level he knew was truly dangerous. Churchill decided the moment called for a proclamation. He declared the Battle of the Atlantic, a formal name for a struggle that had been raging for months, and he meant to elevate it above every other concern. A new committee was formed with the Prime Minister himself in the chair, meeting weekly to hammer out priorities. The directive he issued was blunt and urgent, calling for the U-boat to be hunted wherever it could be found, in the shipyard, in the dock, and at sea. Nothing less than survival hung on the outcome. But the battle was not fought only by men in warships. On the home front, the Ministry of Food launched its own campaign, urging every housewife to dig for victory and save flour to save ships. Marguerite Patten, a young food advisor in Cambridge, set up her stall in the market and demonstrated how to stretch rations using grated potato as a substitute for wheat that crossed the Atlantic from Canada. A single egg was a treasure, and the ration of meat was measured in pennies. Every family learned that feeding themselves was part of the war effort, that the U-boat was trying to starve them, and that their kitchen was a front line. In February, the enemy demonstrated just how dangerous that front line had become. Convoy HG-53, homebound from Gibraltar, was found by a Focke-Wulf Condor, a long-range bomber that could patrol far out over the ocean. The Condor homed in on the convoy and radioed its position to a pack of U-boats that had been waiting for just such a contact. First the aircraft struck, then the submarines closed in, and the combination proved devastating. 5 ships went down under the Condor's bombs and machine guns before the U-boats even fired a torpedo. The following day, a submarine finished off a 6th vessel, and then the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper appeared, guided to the scene by the same signals that had drawn the pack. 7 more ships were lost to her guns. In 2 days, 13 ships from a single convoy had been sent to the bottom, and the British public was never told the full scale of the disaster. The Prime Minister absorbed the news in grim silence. His private secretary, John Colville, tried to soften the blow with a gentle word, calling it distressing. Churchill did not agree. Distressing, he repeated, was not the word. It was terrifying. If this continued, he said quietly, it would be the end of them. The Prime Minister's statistical branch tracked every ton lost, every ship sunk, and the figures were brutal enough to force a change in strategy, but the change had not yet arrived. March brought the reckoning the U-boat arm had dreaded. 3 of Germany's greatest aces put to sea in the same week, each bound for the convoy routes south of Iceland. Prien sailed in U-47, the boat that had humiliated the Royal Navy at Scapa Flow. Schepke followed in U-100, handsome and fearless, fresh from a holiday in the Bavarian Alps where the local children had worshipped him. Kretschmer, the tonnage king, slipped out of Lorient in U-99, carrying a crew that had learned to trust his cold-blooded judgment completely. The first blow fell on convoy OB-293. Prien attacked and sank 3 ships, but the escorts were waiting with something new. They carried radar, an electronic eye that could see through the blackest Atlantic night. The pack was scattered, and U-47 was forced under and hunted. When the boat failed to answer repeated signals from U-boat command, the staff at Kerneville grew anxious. Prien and his entire crew were gone, lost to an unknown cause, somewhere in the icy waters west of Rockall. The Bull of Scapa had made his last patrol. The second blow came 10 days later, on the night of March 17th. Schepke's U-100 was caught on the surface by the radar of the destroyer Vanok. Before the crew could react, the destroyer was upon them, ramming the U-boat squarely on the conning tower. The impact crushed Schepke against his own periscope, and U-100 plunged downward with only 6 survivors. That same night, Kretschmer's boat was found by the ASDIC of HMS Walker, the very destroyer he had evaded the previous summer. Depth charges wrecked U-99's instruments, forcing her to the surface, and Kretschmer gave the order to abandon ship. The crew was pulled from the freezing Atlantic, and the tonnage king became a prisoner of war. At U-boat headquarters in Lorient, the silence was unbearable. For days, Dönitz sent repeated signals to his missing aces, begging for a reply, hoping against hope that a damaged radio was the only problem. No answer came. The staff knew what that meant. In the radio room of U-110, a young operator named Heinz Wild listened to the desperate traffic and understood that Prien, Schepke, and Kretschmer were never coming back. The loss felt personal, like a death in the family. The 3 aces had accounted for more than 600,000 tons of Allied shipping between them. Kretschmer alone had sunk 43 ships, a total that no other commander would ever match. Dönitz tried to shield the German public from the blow, delaying any announcement about Prien for weeks. But the news leaked through British propaganda broadcasts, and the rumours spread, wild stories that Prien had been sent to a concentration camp for disloyalty. The truth was simpler, and worse. The U-boat had lost its greatest hunters. At the end of March, Dönitz made a decision he had hoped never to take. He withdrew his remaining boats from the western approaches, the waters west of Ireland where the convoys were thickest, and sent them west of Iceland. It was the first strategic retreat of the campaign, an admission that the defence had grown too strong. The Knight's Cross that each ace had worn at his throat, that glittering badge of honour that Hitler himself had pinned on Prien after Scapa Flow, now seemed a cruel emblem of what had been taken. The hunt would continue, but the hunt had changed forever. Despite these losses, the U-boat fleet was expanding rapidly, and fresh crews were pouring out of the Baltic training grounds. The decisive phase of the Battle of the Atlantic was about to begin. On the morning of May 9, 1941, the German submarine U-110 was cruising west of Ireland. Kapitänleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp was in command. He was the same officer who had sunk the liner Athenia on the very first day of the war. Lemp had spotted a westbound convoy, OB 318, and decided to attack while submerged at periscope depth. It was a bold gamble in daylight. As his torpedoes struck 2 freighters on the flank of the convoy, the escort screen reacted instantly. The British destroyers and corvettes of Escort Group 3 swept in with their ASDIC sets pinging, and within minutes U-110 was pinned down and under attack. The depth charges detonated with terrible precision around the hull of U-110. The boat shuddered violently as valves burst and water began to pour into the compartments. The electric motors failed, the depth gauge shattered, and the chief engineer reported that the surfacing valve was damaged. Lemp realized he was trapped. He gave the order to blow all remaining compressed air into the ballast tanks, and the boat began to rise. When the hatch was flung open, Lemp saw 3 British warships closing in, their guns already blazing. Balmy climbed the slippery deck of the abandoned U-boat, climbed down through the conning tower hatch, and found himself in a dimly lit, eerily silent world. The boat appeared deserted, but it was still hissing with compressed air. He and his men searched the compartments rapidly, unsure if the German crew had set scuttling charges. In the radio room, Balmy found something that made him catch his breath, a typewriter-like device with glowing keys. It was an Enigma cipher machine, still in its operating position. Alongside it lay codebooks, signal sheets, and the current key tables for the U-boat's top-secret communications network. The boarding party worked for 6 hours, methodically stripping U-110 of every piece of intelligence they could carry. The Enigma machine, the cipher documents, the charts indicating German minefields, and the technical manuals were all carefully packed into crates and transferred to HMS Bulldog. Balme ate his sandwiches at Lemp's own desk, surrounded by the commander's personal belongings. When the crates were finally secured, the Navy attempted to tow U-110 to Iceland, but she sank the following morning. The secret of Operation Primrose held. The Germans had no idea what had been taken. Within days, the crates arrived at Bletchley Park, the top-secret code-breaking centre housed in a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire. For months, the codebreakers in Hut 8 had been struggling to crack the naval Enigma, the most complex of all German ciphers. The material from U-110 gave them exactly what they needed: a working machine, the current rotor settings, and the daily key tables. By June, the Royal Navy's Operational Intelligence Centre, under Commander Roger Wynne, was reading the U-boat command's most sensitive signals, often within hours of their transmission. Ultra-intelligence had arrived. For Karl Donitz, the summer of 1941 became a season of baffling failure. His U-boats were patrolling in greater numbers than ever before, yet they could not find the convoys. Whenever his boats formed a patrol line across the expected route of a homebound convoy, the British ships seemed to slip around them. The handful of contacts that did occur were met by heavy escort screens that seemed to be waiting for the attack. In July, not a single loaded merchant ship was sunk in the North Atlantic. More than 400 ships crossed safely, and the Royal Navy's submarine tracking room followed every move the U-boats made. The key to this success was the use of ultra-intelligence. The tracking room in the Admiralty's Citadel, a dingy, windowless bunker thick with cigarette smoke, plotted every known U-boat position based on decrypted signals. This information was fed directly to the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, where Commander-in-Chief Admiral Percy Noble could reroute convoys around the waiting packs. Donitz suspected a security leak and ordered multiple investigations, but the Kriegsmarine's cipher experts repeatedly assured him that Enigma was unbreakable. He accepted their word, though his war diary recorded his growing unease. The frustration of the U-boat commanders was matched by the growing pressure from Berlin. Hitler was focused on the invasion of the Soviet Union, which had begun in June, and he diverted boats to the Arctic and the Mediterranean. Donitz protested bitterly that the Atlantic was the decisive theatre, but his arguments carried little weight. The number of operational boats in the North Atlantic fell even as the total fleet grew. The summer of 1941 was the quietest period the U-boat arm had known since the fall of France. And at the Admiralty in London, for the first time in 2 years, there was cautious hope. In the autumn, tensions with the United States began to escalate dramatically. American destroyers had been escorting British convoys since July under President Franklin Roosevelt's policy of giving all aid short of war. U-boats were under strict orders from Hitler to avoid any incident with American warships. But on the night of October 31st, the commander of U-552, Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp, spotted a destroyer on the edge of eastbound convoy HX-156. Through his periscope in the dawn half-light, Topp could not identify her flag. He fired a single torpedo. The torpedo struck the USS Reuben James on the port side, cutting the ship in two. The forward section exploded instantly, sending a plume of flame and steel skyward. The stern remained afloat for 5 minutes, fuel oil spilling into the sea and covering the struggling survivors in a black choking coat. As the twisted wreckage slipped beneath the waves, the ship's own depth charges detonated, killing many of the men already in the water. Only 45 of the 160-man crew were pulled from the Atlantic. The Reuben James was the first United States Navy warship lost in the Second World War. Topp did not learn the full horror of what he had done until after the war. For nights on end, he later confessed. He could not get the image out of his mind. When he reported the incident to Donitz, the admiral was remarkably calm. "You acted correctly," he told Topp. The American presence in the Atlantic had been provocative for months, and the rules of engagement were dangerously ambiguous. In Berlin, Hitler forbade any public celebration of the sinking. He was still determined to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States, while the war in the East remained unresolved. The diplomatic situation changed dramatically on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft launched a devastating strike on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Hitler was taken completely by surprise. The Japanese had not informed their German ally of their plans. But honoring his commitment to the Axis Pact, Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days later for Karl Donitz. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He immediately ordered Operation Paukenschlag, a roll of the drums, a surprise assault on merchant shipping along the eastern seaboard of America. Donitz had been planning this operation for months. He knew that American coastal shipping was virtually unescorted, that American cities refused to impose blackouts, and that the United States Navy had no effective convoy system. The hunting, he predicted, would be spectacular. On the night of December 11th, Dönitz's signal went out to a handful of large Type 9 boats waiting in the Bay of Biscay to begin their westward crossing. Among their commanders was Korvettenkapitan Reinhard Hardigan of U-123, a former naval pilot who had taken command of a successful boat and chafed at the restrictions of the summer. Now his leash was off. As Hardigan's boat set course for the American coast, a very different battle was reaching its climax in the eastern Atlantic. Convoy HG-76, homebound from Gibraltar, had sailed with a powerful escort screen of 17 warships, including the first escort carrier to be used in the Atlantic, HMS Audacity. The convoy's escort group was commanded by Commander F.J. Walker, a tough anti-submarine specialist who had trained his ships to hunt U-boats as aggressively as they defended the convoy. Walker's tactics were radical. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he took the fight to the enemy. Dönitz had assembled a pack of 10 U-boats across HG-76's expected route, including the experienced ace Engelbert Endras in U-567. But the pack was detected and shadowed from the moment it approached the convoy. Audacity's aircraft forced the U-boats to dive repeatedly, while Walker's escorts mounted aggressive counterattacks. One by one, the U-boats fell, first U-127, then U-131, then U-434. Each sinking was a small victory, but Dönitz refused to withdraw. He ordered the most experienced commanders to press the attack. On the night of December 21st, Endras attempted to break through the screen. The battle that followed was ferocious and confused. Walker's sloop, HMS Stork, rammed and sank one U-boat in a close-range night action. Audacity herself was torpedoed and lost, but her aircraft had already done their damage. Endras's U-567 was depth-charged and sunk with all hands. The final toll was 5 U-boats destroyed for the loss of Audacity and 2 escorts. It was the single most successful anti-submarine operation the Royal Navy had yet conducted. At U-boat headquarters in Lorient, Dönitz was forced to concede that the chances of success in the North Atlantic had become smaller than the risk of loss. The year 1941 ended in a strange silence. By Christmas, not a single German U-boat was on patrol anywhere in the North Atlantic. The hunters had become the hunted. The capture of U-110 and the breaking of the Enigma code had given the Allies an invisible advantage that Dönitz could neither match nor fully comprehend. The United States was now in the war, bringing with it the industrial power and shipbuilding capacity that would eventually overwhelm the U-boat arm. The war was far from won, but the foundations of victory had been laid in the deep Atlantic waters and the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park. Of the men who fought this phase of the battle, their fates diverged widely. Fritz Julius Lemp, the commander who had fired the first shots of the war at sea, was lost in the Atlantic after the capture of his boat, never knowing that his failure to scuttle U-110 had handed the Allies their greatest intelligence prize. Günther Prien and Joachim Schepke were lost with their boats in March 1941. Their deaths a devastating blow from which the first generation of U-boat aces never fully recovered. David Balmy, the young sub-lieutenant, who had led the boarding party onto the crippled U-boat, was decorated by King George VI and lived to see the defeat of the navy he had helped to blind. Karl Dönitz survived the war and served 10 years in Spandau prison for war crimes, but he never fully understood why his U-boats had failed at the moment of their greatest opportunity. Winston Churchill survived the war and lived to see the final victory of the Allied navies, while Otto Kretschmer returned home from captivity to serve in the post-war German Navy, a living symbol of the naval professionalism that had defined him. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single weapon or a single decision. It was won by the men who sailed in the corvettes and the destroyers, by the codebreakers in their cramped huts, by the merchant seamen who crossed the ocean again and again in ships that were too slow and too vulnerable. It was won because the Allies learned to listen. The German Navy placed its faith in a machine that was supposed to be unbreakable, and a few determined men proved it could be broken. That is the truth of this struggle, a truth that still echoes in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. If you have family stories from the Battle of the Atlantic, or memories passed down from those who served in the merchant fleet or the escort groups, we would be grateful to hear them in the comments below. We read every one. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to support more historical storytelling like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It makes a real difference to us. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.